Miss Marple and the Deadly Garden Party. Chapter 1. An Afternoon of Roses and Ruin. The June afternoon had settled over St. Mary Mead, with the drowsy contentment of a cat in sunshine. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary chair beneath the copper beech tree at Gossington Hall, her knitting needles clicking with metronomic precision as she worked on a pale blue cardigan for her great-nephew. Around her, the annual midsummer garden party unfolded with all the predictable ceremony of a village ritual that had been repeated, with only minor variations for the past 43 years. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, mistress of Gossington Hall and hostess of this year's festivities, moved among her guests with the gracious energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed these obligations. Her husband, Colonel Arthur Bantry, stood near the refreshment tent, looking as though he wished himself anywhere else, preferably on a trout stream somewhere in Scotland. But duty was duty, and so he smiled gamely at the vicar's wife and accepted yet another cucumber sandwich he had no intention of eating. "Such a lovely day for it," remarked Miss Hartnell, settling her considerable bulk into the chair beside Miss Marple. "Though I must say, I'm surprised to see Lydia Folliot here, after all that unpleasantness last month." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment before resuming their rhythm. "Unpleasantness?" she inquired with gentle interest, though she was perfectly aware of what unpleasantness Miss Hartnell meant. In a village like St. Mary Mead, one heard everything eventually. "Well," Miss Hartnell leaned closer, her voice dropping to that particular register that somehow carried further than ordinary speech. "The business with her nephew, of course, Gerald Folliot, though I suppose one shouldn't speak ill of the dead." "Dead?" This time Miss Marple's surprise was genuine. "I had understood he was merely away." "Oh, my dear Miss Marple, haven't you heard? Though perhaps you've been so occupied with your church duties. They found him 3 weeks ago in London. An overdose, they said, though between you and me." Miss Hartnell tapped the side of her nose significantly. There were whispers about debts, gambling debts, the unsavoury sort. Across the lawn, Lydia Folliot stood alone near the rose arbour, a tall, striking woman in her early 50s, with dark hair going elegantly grey at the temples. She wore black, not mourning black, but a sophisticated black linen dress that seemed designed to ward off sympathy. Her face was composed, almost blank, but Miss Marple noticed how her fingers gripped her teacup, and how her gaze kept drifting toward a young man in conversation with Colonel Bantry. "That's Michael Stroud," Miss Hartnell supplied, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Lydia's nephew-in-law, if you can call it that. Gerald's cousin on the other side. Come down from London for the funeral and stayed on. Rather odd, don't you think? He was never close to Gerald. Quite the opposite from what I've heard. Always competing for old Mrs. Folliot's attention before she died." Miss Marple filed this information away with the quiet efficiency of someone storing preserves for winter. "How interesting," she murmured. The afternoon wore on. Tea was served, proper tea, with Mrs. Bantry's famous sponge cake and strawberry tarts that drew admiring comments from everyone except Dr. Haydock, who made his usual grumbling remarks about sugar consumption. The Women's Institute had set up a white elephant stall, and there was an archery competition on the far lawn that drew a small, enthusiastic crowd. It was nearly 5 o'clock when Miss Lavinia Price rose from her seat at the head table with exaggerated care. A widow of some 70 years, she had been president of the Women's Institute for longer than anyone could remember, and showed no signs of relinquishing the position. She was a small, desiccated woman with the imperious manner of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I must speak with Lydia about the harvest festival arrangements," she announced to no one in particular. "The woman has been avoiding her responsibilities quite long enough." She made her way across the lawn toward the rose arbor where Lydia Folliot still stood, now in conversation with a younger woman, pretty, blonde Diana Archer, the doctor's daughter, who had recently returned from finishing school in Switzerland with airs that had not endeared her to the village. Miss Marple watched as Miss Price approached the two women. Words were exchanged. She was too far away to hear them, but body language spoke volumes. Miss Price's finger jabbed the air emphatically. Lydia Folliot's face remained studiously neutral, while Diana Archer's expression shifted from polite interest to something that looked remarkably like fear. And then Miss Price turned sharply and walked away from them, her back rigid with outrage, heading toward the small folly at the garden's edge, a decorative structure covered in climbing roses where one might sit and enjoy the view of the ornamental pond. "Trouble in paradise," murmured Miss Hartnell with obvious satisfaction. 20 minutes later, when Miss Price had not returned and her daughter Edith came looking for her, they found the president of the Women's Institute seated on the bench in the folly, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, quite thoroughly dead. The teacup lay shattered at her feet, and among the scattered fragments, Miss Marple's sharp eyes would later notice something that everyone else overlooked. A faint dusting of white powder, almost invisible against the pale gravel, except where it had mixed with spilled tea into a telltale paste. But in that first moment of discovery, as Edith Price's screams brought the garden party to its sudden, dreadful halt, all was confusion, and in that confusion, Miss Marple saw Michael Stroud slip something into his jacket pocket with the swift, guilty motion of a man who wishes very much not to be observed. She saw this, and she thought of a small village in India, where she had once stayed with a distant cousin, and of a cook who had poisoned her mistress with something in her tea. How very interesting, Miss Marple thought, her knitting needles resuming their gentle click, click, click. The game, as they say, was afoot. Chapter 2. Whispers and Theories. The police arrived within the hour, summoned by Colonel Bantry's telephone call to Much Benham. Inspector Slack, a name that Miss Marple had always found rather unfortunate, descended upon Gossington Hall with his usual combination of energy and misplaced confidence. He was a sandy-haired man in his early 40s, who believed firmly in the evidence of his own eyes and very little else. Natural causes, most likely, he pronounced after a cursory examination of the body, still seated in the folly as the photographer went about his grim work. Woman of that age, the excitement of the party, probably heart failure. We'll know more after the post-mortem, of course. Dr. Haydock, who had been among the first to reach the scene, made a non-committal sound. Lavinia Price had the constitution of an ox, slack. I examined her just last month. Her heart was sound as a bell. Nevertheless, Inspector Slack said with the air of a man who would not be contradicted, there's no obvious sign of foul play. No wounds, no violence. Sometimes these things simply happen. The guests had been assembled in the drawing-room and on the terrace, none permitted to leave until statements had been taken. The festive atmosphere had curdled into something thick and uncomfortable. People spoke in hushed clusters, and Miss Marple observed how naturally they separated into groups. Not by friendship, but by suspicion and alliance. Mrs. Bantry approached Miss Marple with a tea tray, her usually cheerful face drawn with distress. "Jane, this is absolutely dreadful. Poor Lavinia. Though I must confess, She was being particularly difficult today. She cornered me earlier about the flower arrangements for the Harvest Festival, insisted that my ideas were entirely unsuitable. She paused, then added in a lower voice, "I saw her arguing with Lydia Folliot. Rather heated it looked." "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly, accepting a fresh cup of tea. "I noticed that as well. Miss Hartnell mentioned some unpleasantness regarding Mrs. Folliot's nephew." "Oh, that business." Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "Gerald Folliot was always wild, even as a boy. The gambling didn't surprise anyone, though the manner of his death was rather shocking. But you know, Jane, I heard something quite extraordinary from my housemaid, whose cousin works at the London hotel where Gerald died. She said there were questions about whether it was truly accidental." Before Miss Marple could respond, Miss Hartnell materialized at her elbow, fairly vibrating with the importance of having information to share. "Have you heard what Edith Price is saying? She's telling Inspector Slack that her mother received a threatening letter just 3 days ago. Anonymous, naturally. Something about old sins coming home to roost." "How very dramatic," murmured Miss Marple, though one does wonder why Miss Price didn't mention this earlier. "Exactly what I thought." Miss Hartnell's eyes gleamed. "Rather convenient to remember it now, wouldn't you say? Though between ourselves, Edith and her mother were barely on speaking terms. Money troubles, I believe. Lavinia controlled the purse strings rather tightly, and Edith has expensive tastes." She leaned closer. "She's been seeing that Michael Stroud, you know, rather more than is strictly proper for a woman of her age." Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm, but her mind was working quite differently. A threatening letter, Gerald Folliot's suspicious death, Michael Stroud's presence in the village, the white powder by the teacup, and that curious moment when Diana Archer's face had shown such naked fear. Across the terrace, Lydia Folliot sat alone, her black dress stark against the floral cushions of the garden furniture. She held herself with remarkable composure, but Miss Marple noticed how her gaze kept drifting toward Michael Stroud, who stood near the French windows in conversation with Inspector Slack. Was that anger in her expression, or fear? Diana Archer had positioned herself near her father, Dr. Haydock, and Miss Marple observed how the young woman's hands trembled as she lifted her teacup. The doctor himself seemed preoccupied, his usually ruddy face pale and thoughtful. "Miss Marple?" Inspector Slack's voice cut through her observations. He stood before her, notebook in hand, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "I understand you were seated near the Folly this afternoon. Did you observe anything unusual?" Miss Marple considered her response carefully. "I'm afraid my attention was primarily on my knitting, Inspector, though I did see Miss Price speak with Mrs. Folliot and Miss Archer shortly before she went to the Folly. The conversation appeared rather tense." "Tense how?" "Well, Miss Price seemed quite agitated. She was gesturing rather emphatically. I couldn't hear the words, of course, but one develops a sense for these things after so many years of village life." Inspector Slack made a note, though his expression suggested he found this observation of limited value. "And you saw nothing else? No one approaching the Folly after Miss Price entered?" Miss Marple appeared to think. "The roses were quite lovely this year, Inspector. Mrs. Bantry's gardener has done exceptional work with the climbing varieties. They rather obscure the view of the Folly from certain angles." This was perfectly true, though not quite an answer to his question. Inspector Slack nodded and moved on to his next interview. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the remaining guests were finally permitted to leave, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return home. Mrs. Bantry accompanied her to the gate, wringing her hands. "The post-mortem is tomorrow," she said quietly. Dr. Haydock seemed very concerned about something, but he wouldn't say what. "Jane, Do you think, could it really be murder? Miss Marple paused at the gate, looking back at Gossington Hall with its perfectly manicured lawns and elegant facades. Such a civilized setting, such well-mannered people. My dear Dolly, she said gently, in my experience, murder is not nearly as uncommon as one might wish, and when it occurs, it's rarely committed by strangers. One might almost say it's a tragedy that grows from familiarity. She left Mrs. Bantry looking rather shaken, and made her way home through the village, nodding to acquaintances but speaking to no one. Her mind was occupied with patterns. Patterns of behaviour, patterns of motive, patterns that would only become clear when one stepped back far enough to see the whole picture. But one thing was already quite clear. Inspector Slack's theory of natural causes was entirely wrong. Miss Marple had seen that white powder, and she remembered the case in India all too well. She also remembered how the guilty party in that instance had been the last person anyone suspected, someone who had seemed above reproach. History, she reflected, had a rather unfortunate habit of repeating itself. Chapter 3. The Poison in the Cup. The post-mortem results arrived the following afternoon, delivered to Inspector Slack at the police station in Much Benham and communicated to the village through that peculiar osmosis by which news, particularly scandalous news, travels through small communities. Miss Marple heard it first from her maid, who had heard it from the butcher's boy, who had heard it from his sister, who worked at the police station. By tea-time, everyone in St. Mary Mead knew that Miss Lavinia Price had been murdered. Digitalis poisoning, Dr. Haydock confirmed when he called upon Miss Marple that evening. He stood in her sitting room, looking grave and considerably older than his 60 years. Massive dose, he said, accepting the glass of sherry she offered. Enough to stop her heart within minutes. It was in the tea, obviously. The question is how it got there. Miss Marple poured her own sherry with a steady hand. Digitalis, she mused. From foxglove, of course. There's quite a lot of it growing wild around the village. Mrs. Bantry had some in her herbaceous borders. Half the gardens in England have foxglove, Dr. Haydock agreed. It's identifying who had the knowledge and opportunity that presents the difficulty. He paused, then added, Inspector Slack has decided to focus his investigation on Lydia Folliot. Has he indeed? The argument with Miss Price, you see. Several people witnessed it. And there's the matter of her nephew's death. Slack has been in contact with the London police. Apparently, there were questions about the circumstances. Gerald Folliot owed money to some rather unsavoury individuals. The official verdict was accidental overdose, but there were inconsistencies in the evidence. And Inspector Slack believes Mrs. Folliot killed her nephew and then killed Miss Price. Miss Marple's tone was gently inquiring, without judgment. He's building a theory that Miss Price knew something about Gerald's death, perhaps witnessed something or heard something. The threatening letter Edith Price mentioned. Slack thinks Lavinia might have been threatening to expose Lydia. Miss Marple sipped her sherry thoughtfully. It's a very neat theory, perhaps a little too neat. Dr. Haydock smiled grimly. That's what I thought, but Slack is convinced. He's planning to arrest her tomorrow. After the doctor left, Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window, looking out at her garden where the evening light painted everything in shades of amber and gold. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap. She was thinking about patterns again. Not the pattern of her cardigan, but the pattern of human behaviour. Inspector Slack's theory had a fatal flaw, though he couldn't see it. It assumed that the murder of Miss Price was connected to Gerald Folliot's death in London. But what if the connection ran in the opposite direction? What if Gerald's death was the consequence, not the cause? She thought of the white powder she had seen mixed with the spilled tea. She thought of Michael Stroud's furtive gesture, slipping something into his pocket. She thought of Diana Archer's fear, and Edith Price's convenient memory of a threatening letter. And she thought of something else, something that had been nagging at the edges of her mind since the garden party. A small detail seemingly insignificant, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the devil resided quite comfortably in small details. The following morning brought rain, a steady, dispiriting drizzle that turned the village streets grey and slick. Miss Marple, armed with her umbrella and a determination that would have done credit to Wellington at Waterloo, made her way to Gossington Hall. Mrs. Bantry received her in the morning room, looking harassed. "Jane, thank goodness! I've had Inspector Slack here already this morning, trampling mud through the house and asking the most impertinent questions about my foxglove plants. He actually suggested I might have been cultivating them for nefarious purposes, as if I would poison anyone, let alone at my own garden party. How very trying for you, dear," Miss Marple murmured. "I wonder, might I speak with your gardener? I'm considering adding some foxglove to my own borders, and I've always admired your specimens." This was a transparent fiction, and Mrs. Bantry knew it, but she was accustomed to Miss Marple's methods. "Of course, he'll be in the greenhouse at this hour." Old Higgins, the gardener, was a man of few words and many opinions, most of them unfavourable, but he warmed slightly when discussing his plants, and Miss Marple listened with apparent fascination to his discourse on soil conditions and pest management. "Your foxglove is particularly impressive," she observed. "I noticed at the party how tall the spikes were. You must take great care with them." "Aye, and I keep a close watch too," Higgins said darkly. "Dangerous plants, foxglove. I was telling that young gentleman the very same thing when he asked about them." Miss Marple's expression remained placidly interested. "Young gentleman? That Mr. Stroud came asking questions about the foxglove 3 weeks ago, maybe a month. Wanted to know all about them. How much was poisonous, what parts of the plant, that sort of thing. Said he was interested in botany." Higgins snorted. "Botany? I've seen his type before. More interested in mischief than plants." "How very curious," Miss Marple said. "And did anyone else ask about the foxglove?" "Not about foxglove specifically, though Miss Diana was poking about the poison garden, that's what I call it. All the dangerous plants together where people can't get at them accidental-like. She was looking at the monkshood, the belladonna, all of them. Gave me quite a turn when I caught her at it." Miss Marple thanked Higgins and made her way back to the house, her mind working rapidly. Michael Stroud had been asking about foxglove a month ago, well before Miss Price's death, but after Gerald Folliot's demise in London. Diana Archer had been examining the poison plants as well. She found Mrs. Bantry pacing the morning room. "Jane, the most dreadful thing. Inspector Slack has just arrested Lydia Folliot. He came and took her away in his motor car, right through the village for everyone to see. The poor woman looked absolutely stricken. Did she say anything? She kept insisting she was innocent, naturally. But Slack found something in her house. A book about poisonous plants, with a section on foxglove marked, and they found traces of dried foxglove in her garden shed. Mrs. Bantry wrung her hands. "It looks very bad for her, Jane. Very bad indeed." Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the rain trace patterns on the glass. Inspector Slack had his evidence, and his suspect, and his neat theory. He would be quite satisfied with himself. But Miss Marple was thinking about that book on poisonous plants, and wondering who had so conveniently placed it where it would be found. She was thinking about Michael Stroud and Diana Archer, and about Edith Price with her expensive tastes and her conveniently remembered letter. Most of all, she was thinking about Gerald Folliot, dead in a London hotel, with questions surrounding his death. The key to everything, she was beginning to suspect, lay not in St. Mary Mead at all, but in London, in whatever had happened in that hotel room, and whoever had been there when the young man died. "Dolly," she said suddenly, "do you remember what Mrs. Folliot said about her nephew? About why he was in London?" Mrs. Bantry looked startled. "Something about a business meeting, I think. Or was it visiting friends? I can't quite recall. But Miss Marple could recall. And she remembered something else that had been said at the garden party by Miss Hartnell about Gerald and Michael Stroud competing for their grandmother's attention. And, presumably, her money. The pattern was beginning to emerge, though it was still incomplete. Like her knitting, it would only make sense when the final stitches were in place. Chapter 4. The London Connection. Miss Marple's great-nephew, Raymond West, was a successful novelist who lived in London and maintained a wide circle of acquaintances in various professions. He was also, despite his occasional exasperation with what he called her morbid preoccupation with village murders, rather fond of his aunt and generally willing to assist her inquiries. She telephoned him that afternoon from the post office, where Miss Pepmarsh, the postmistress, made a valiant effort to appear as though she weren't listening to every word. "Raymond, dear, I wonder if you might do me a small favour. There was a young man who died in London recently, Gerald Folliot. I believe it was at the Grosvenor Hotel. The official verdict was accidental overdose, but I understand there were some questions about the circumstances." Raymond's voice came through with audible curiosity. "Aunt Jane, are you involving yourself in another suspicious death? I'm merely gathering information, dear, for a friend." There was a pause, during which Miss Marple could almost hear Raymond's internal struggle between concern for her safety and his novelist's instinct for a good story. The latter one, as she had known it would. "I'll make some inquiries. I know a chap at Scotland Yard who owes me a favour. Give me until tomorrow." Raymond was as good as his word. When he telephoned the following day, he had considerable information to share. "Your Gerald Folliot was quite a character, Aunt Jane. Gambled heavily, owed money all over London. He was found dead in his hotel room on the 15th of May. Single dose of morphine, self-administered apparently, though the needle marks suggested he wasn't a habitual user. The investigation was complicated by the fact that he'd had several visitors that day." "Visitors?" Miss Marple's voice sharpened slightly. "3, according to the hotel staff. First was his cousin, Michael Stroud, who arrived around 2 o'clock and stayed perhaps an hour. They were heard arguing, something about an inheritance, the porter thought. Then a young woman came around 4, blonde, pretty, well-dressed. She gave the name Diana Archer." Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. "Did she indeed?" "She was there for about 30 minutes, left looking rather upset, according to the chambermaid. The third visitor came around 6, a woman in her 50s, the desk clerk said. She didn't give a name, but she was wearing a rather distinctive brooch, a large amber piece set in silver, rather old-fashioned. And Gerald Folliot was found dead the next morning, around 8 a.m., when the maid came to clean. The morphine had been administered sometime during the night, the coroner estimated. There was no suicide note, which was odd, but no concrete evidence of foul play either. The hotel room door had been locked from the inside, you see. Windows closed. No sign of forced entry. "A locked room," Miss Marple murmured. "How very interesting." After the call ended, she sat in her parlour, her mind working through the implications. 3 visitors on the day before Gerald's death. Michael Stroud. No surprise there, given the competition over their grandmother's estate. Diana Archer. Now what business could Dr. Haydock's daughter have had with a London gambler? And a third woman, older, wearing a distinctive amber brooch. Miss Marple rose and made her way to her desk, where she kept her correspondence. Among the various letters and cards was an invitation to the garden party at Gossington Hall. She studied the list of guests Mrs. Bantry had helpfully included. 20 minutes later, she was once again at Gossington Hall, where she found Mrs. Bantry in a state of considerable agitation. "Jane, have you heard? Edith Price has collapsed. Dr. Haydock is with her now. She's been staying here since her mother's death. I couldn't very well turn her out. And this morning, she simply fainted dead away. The doctor says it's nervous exhaustion, but between you and me, I think it's guilt. The woman has been behaving most strangely." "Has she indeed? In what way?" "Well, for one thing, she's been going through her mother's papers obsessively. Searching for something, I'm convinced of it. And she's had several telephone calls from London. She takes them in the library and closes the door. But I heard her voice yesterday. She sounded quite desperate, saying something about the agreement and too dangerous now." Miss Marple filed this away. "I wonder, Dolly, if I might see something. Do you recall what jewellery Miss Price was wearing at the garden party?" Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled but obliging. "Let me think. She had that dreadful amber brooch she always wore. Her mother's, passed down through the family. Quite valuable, I believe, though terribly unfashionable. Why do you ask?" "Just a thought," Miss Marple said. "And where is Edith now?" "Resting in the blue bedroom. Dr. Haydock gave her a sedative." "Then perhaps I might take a brief look at Miss Price's jewellery. If she's been going through her mother's papers, she might have overlooked something important." Mrs. Bantry led her to the guest room, where Edith Price's belongings were arranged with meticulous care. The jewellery case sat on the dressing table, and Miss Marple examined its contents with the focused attention of a jeweller appraising stones. The amber brooch was there, exactly as Mrs. Bantry had described. Large, old-fashioned, unmistakable. Miss Marple lifted it carefully, noting the hallmark on the silver setting. Then she noticed something else, a small leather notebook tucked beneath the jewellery tray. "How curious," she murmured, opening it. The notebook contained dates and times written in a cramped, anxious hand. Miss Marple's eye was drawn immediately to an entry from mid-May. "London, May 15th, GF, 6:30 p.m. Final warning delivered. He must comply or face consequences." Mrs. Bantry peered over her shoulder. "GF, Gerald Folliot. Jane, do you think Lavinia Price was in London the day before he died?" "I think it very likely," Miss Marple said quietly. She turned the pages, finding other entries. April 23rd, MS observed meeting with GF at the Red Lion. Discussing grandmother's will. May 1st, DA received letter from GF, intercepted at post office. Intercepted. Mrs. Bantry's voice rose. "But that means—" "It means," Miss Marple said, "that Miss Price was conducting a rather extensive surveillance of several people in this village, and I think we can guess why. She knew something. Something about Gerald Folliot's death, or perhaps about what led to it. And she was using that knowledge for leverage, blackmail." Mrs. Bantry breathed. Lavinia Price was a blackmailer. It would explain the threatening letter Edith mentioned, though I suspect that letter was sent to Miss Price, not by her. Someone she was blackmailing decided to silence her permanently. Miss Marple closed the notebook carefully. The pattern was becoming clearer now. 3 people had visited Gerald Folliot the day before his death. One of them, or perhaps all of them working together, had killed him. Miss Price had discovered this, and instead of going to the police, she had chosen to profit from her knowledge. It had been a fatal mistake. "But Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, If Lydia Folliot didn't kill Lavinia, who did? And how did they do it? The tea was poured from a communal pot, and dozens of people drank from it without harm. How was the poison delivered to Miss Price alone? Miss Marple smiled, a small, satisfied expression. That, my dear Dolly, is the question Inspector Slack should have been asking from the beginning, and I believe I may have an answer, or at least the beginnings of one. She looked down at the amber brooch in her hand, thinking of locked hotel rooms and convenient evidence, of Foxglove asking questions asked a month too early, and of a young woman's terrified face. The final pieces were beginning to fall into place. Chapter 5. A small detail. Miss Marple returned home with the notebook carefully wrapped in brown paper and tucked into her handbag. She had every intention of delivering it to Inspector Slack, but first she needed to verify a small detail, one of those seemingly insignificant observations that so often prove to be the hinge upon which entire cases turned. She settled into her chair by the window and retrieved from her work basket not her knitting, but a small stack of newspaper clippings she had quietly accumulated over the past month. Miss Marple was a great reader of newspapers, particularly the society pages and obituaries, which she found remarkably illuminating about human nature. The obituary for Mrs. Beatrice Folliot, grandmother to both Gerald and Michael, was dated from 18 months prior. Beloved matriarch, it read, leaves her considerable estate to be divided between her grandsons, with provisions outlined in a trust to be administered by her solicitor, Mr. Edmund Craddock of Craddock & Sons, Lincoln's Inn. Miss Marple made a note of the solicitor's name. Then she turned to a more recent clipping, a small item from the social pages of the London Times, dated early April. It mentioned an engagement announcement. Dr. Reginald Haydock of St. Mary Mead is pleased to announce the engagement of his daughter, Miss Diana Archer, to Mr. Gerald Folliot of London. How very interesting. An engagement that had apparently been broken off before any formal wedding plans could be made, and never mentioned in the village, or if mentioned, done so quietly enough that even Miss Hartnell's efficient gossip network had missed it. She set the clipping aside and considered the timeline. Gerald and Diana engaged in April. Gerald dead in May. Miss Price murdered in June. And throughout it all, Michael Stroud lurking in the background, with his questions about poisonous plants and his furtive gestures. There was a knock at her door, and her maid showed in an unexpected visitor. Diana Archer herself, looking pale and determined. Miss Marple, the young woman said without preamble, I need your help. They're going to arrest me. Inspector Slack came to the house this morning, asking questions about London, about Gerald. Someone told him I was there at the hotel. He thinks I killed Gerald, and then killed Miss Price because she knew about it. And did you? Miss Marple asked gently, gesturing for Diana to sit. Diana sank into the chair, her composure cracking. No, I mean, I was there, yes. Gerald had written to me, said he wanted to return some things. Personal things. Letters I'd written to him when we were engaged. She twisted her hands together. I didn't want my father to know about the engagement. Gerald was not what he seemed. I discovered things about him, about his debts, his character. I broke it off, but I was terrified the letters would come to light. So I went to London to retrieve them. And did you retrieve them? Yes, he gave them to me willingly enough, though he seemed distracted, worried about something. He kept looking at his watch, said he was expecting another visitor. I left around 4:30. Her voice dropped. The next morning, I heard he was dead. I hoped it was truly an accident, a dreadful coincidence. But then Miss Price approached you, Miss Marple supplied. Diana's head snapped up. How did you know? Because Miss Price approached several people, I suspect. She had discovered something about Gerald's death. Perhaps from the hotel staff, perhaps from some other source, and she was using that information to extract payment for her silence. She wanted money, Diana confirmed miserably. £500, she said if I didn't pay, she would tell my father everything. About the engagement, about my visit to London, about how suspicious it all looked. I didn't have £500. I was desperate enough to kill her. No! Diana's voice was anguished. I wanted to, God help me. I thought about it, but I didn't. I swear to you, Miss Marple. When she died at the garden party, I was relieved. Horribly, shamefully relieved. But I didn't kill her. Miss Marple studied the young woman's face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades observing human nature in all its complexity. Fear, guilt, shame, all these emotions were present. But there was also, she thought, the unmistakable ring of truth. Tell me, she said, did you see anyone else near the Folly before Miss Price went there? Anyone at all? Diana frowned, thinking. I saw Michael Stroud. He was standing near the refreshment tent, quite close to where the tea things were set up. He was, actually, now that I think of it, he seemed to be watching Miss Price rather intently, following her movements. And when Miss Price spoke with you and Mrs. Folliot, what exactly did she say? She said, Diana paused, her face paling further. She said she knew what we'd done, all of us. That we'd conspired together to kill Gerald for the inheritance money, that she had proof, and we would all hang unless we paid her what she demanded. All of you, Miss Marple repeated. Meaning you, Mrs. Folliot, and Michael Stroud? Yes, though it wasn't true. I barely knew Mrs. Folliot, and I'd only met Michael Stroud once, at Gerald's grandmother's funeral. There was no conspiracy. But Miss Marple was thinking that perhaps there had been a conspiracy, just not the one Miss Price had imagined. Perhaps 3 people, each with their own reasons to want Gerald Folliot dead, had found themselves in London on the same day, and perhaps one of them had been clever enough to make use of that coincidence. After Diana left, promising to speak honestly with Inspector Slack if Miss Marple thought it would help, Miss Marple sat quietly for some time. Then she reached for her telephone and placed a call to Raymond in London. I need you to do something else for me, dear, rather urgently. Could you contact that friend of yours at Scotland Yard and ask him about the locked room where Gerald Folliot died? Specifically, I need to know about the windows. Were they merely closed or were they locked? And was there a balcony or fire escape outside? Raymond promised to inquire and ring her back within the hour. When he did, the information he provided was exactly what Miss Marple had suspected. The windows were closed but not locked, Raymond reported. And yes, there was a narrow balcony outside, barely more than a ledge really, but it ran along the entire floor. The rooms on either side were unoccupied that night, which is partly why the police dismissed the possibility of anyone entering that way. Too risky, they thought. But not impossible, Miss Marple said. Not impossible, Raymond agreed. Aunt Jane, what exactly are you thinking? I'm thinking, she said slowly, about a locked room that wasn't quite locked, about 3 people with motives for murder, and a blackmailer who discovered their secret, about poisonous plants and convenient evidence, and about a young man named Michael Stroud, who asked questions about foxglove at precisely the right time, or perhaps the wrong time, depending on one's perspective. She thanked Raymond and rang off, her mind working through the final connections. The method of Gerald's murder was becoming clear. The identity of his killer was almost certain, but the murder of Miss Price, that required a different kind of cunning, a different kind of opportunity. Miss Marple thought about teacups and poison, about gardens and parties, about how a murder might be committed in plain sight when everyone was watching. And suddenly, with the clarity of a puzzle piece sliding into place, she understood exactly how it had been done. Tomorrow, she would need to have a very careful conversation with Inspector Slack. And perhaps, if she was very fortunate, she might arrange a small test. The sort of test that would force a guilty conscience into revealing itself. But tonight, she would finish her blue cardigan and think about human nature, which remained endlessly fascinating and endlessly tragic in equal measure. Chapter 6. Secrets of the Past Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the following morning in a state of considerable irritation. He had come, he informed her stiffly, because Dr. Haydock had insisted that Miss Marple possessed information material to the case, though Slack clearly doubted this would prove to be anything more than village gossip dressed up as detection. "I understand you've arrested Mrs. Folliot," Miss Marple began, pouring tea with steady hands. "We have her in custody, yes. The evidence is quite clear. The book on poisonous plants, the dried foxglove in her shed, her argument with the victim, and her presence in London the day before her nephew died. It all points in one direction, does it?" Miss Marple handed him a cup. "I wonder if you've considered that the evidence might point in that direction because someone wished it to, rather like a signpost that's been deliberately turned to mislead travellers." Slack's jaw tightened. "If you have actual evidence, Miss Marple, I suggest you share it rather than speaking in riddles." She produced Lavinia Price's notebook. "This belonged to the victim. I found it among her daughter's belongings at Gossington Hall. I believe you'll find it most illuminating." Slack read through the notebook with increasing attention, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise, to something approaching alarm. When he looked up, some of the bluster had gone from his manner. "Blackmail," he said flatly. Lavinia Price was blackmailing half the village. "Not quite half," Miss Marple corrected gently, "but certainly 3 specific individuals, all of whom had connections to Gerald Folliot, and all of whom visited him in London the day before his death." She recounted what Raymond had learned from Scotland Yard about the 3 visitors and the supposedly locked room with its accessible balcony. Slack listened with grudging attention. "So you're suggesting," he said slowly, "that Gerald Folliot was murdered by one of these 3 people, and that Miss Price discovered this and attempted to profit from it. I'm suggesting that Miss Price believed she had discovered a conspiracy, when in fact she had stumbled upon something rather different, and that belief cost her her life. Then who killed her? If not Mrs. Folliot, then who? That," Miss Marple said, "requires us to understand exactly how the poison was administered. You see, Inspector, the murderer faced a considerable challenge. Digitalis had to be delivered specifically to Miss Price, yet the tea was poured from a communal pot. How does one poison a single cup when dozens of people are drinking from the same source?" Slack frowned. "The cup itself. Someone could have put poison in her cup beforehand." But Miss Price took her tea from the general service, as did everyone else. The cups were arranged on trays, and people helped themselves. There was no way to ensure Miss Price would take any specific cup. Unless— She paused significantly. "Unless what? Unless the poison wasn't in the cup at all, but in something added to the tea after it was poured. Sugar, for instance, or milk. But everyone uses sugar and milk. Not everyone, Inspector. Some people take their tea black. Others use only sugar or only milk. Miss Price had very particular habits. She always used exactly 2 lumps of sugar and a generous amount of milk. Everyone who knew her was aware of this quirk." Slack's eyes widened. You're saying the poison was in the sugar lumps, but that would mean... It would mean the murderer needed to ensure Miss Price received poisoned sugar lumps, while everyone else received harmless ones. It would require someone to be present at the tea service, someone who could control which sugar went into which cup. Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm. Tell me, Inspector, who was managing the tea service that afternoon? Slack consulted his notes. Several members of the Women's Institute. Mrs. Bantry was overseeing it with help from, let me see, Miss Hartnell, young Diana Archer, and Edith Price. Edith Price, Miss Marple repeated, the victim's own daughter, who stood to inherit her mother's considerable estate, who had expensive tastes and money troubles, who had been in contact with someone in London about an agreement that had become too dangerous. But the notebook, the surveillance. Was Lavinia Price's work? Certainly. But I suspect that when Edith discovered what her mother was doing, she saw an opportunity. Her mother had made enemies, had gathered dangerous information. If Lavinia were to die under suspicious circumstances, there would be no shortage of suspects. Slack was beginning to look convinced. So Edith Price killed her own mother. I believe she did. But not alone, Inspector. I think if you investigate more thoroughly, you'll find that Edith Price had an accomplice. Someone who also had reason to want Lavinia silenced. Someone who provided the poison and helped plan the method. Michael Stroud, Slack said. The notebook mentions he was asking about Foxglove weeks before the murder. Indeed. And I believe you'll find that Mr. Stroud and Miss Price have been rather more than casual acquaintances. Mrs. Bantry mentioned seeing them together, and Miss Hartnell noted the same. A romance, perhaps, or at least an alliance of convenience. Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, looking out at her garden where the foxgloves stood tall and poisonous in the afternoon sun. But there remains the question of Gerald Folliot's death. That murder, I believe, tells us something quite different about Mr. Stroud's character. You think he killed Gerald Folliot as well? I think he killed his cousin for the inheritance, Beatrice Folliot's estate, which would pass entirely to Michael with Gerald dead. The locked room, the appearance of suicide, the convenient overdose, all very carefully planned. He entered through the balcony after Gerald had fallen asleep, administered the morphine, and left the same way. Gerald's visitors earlier that day were entirely innocent, but their presence created a perfect smokescreen of suspicion. Then why did Lavinia Price suspect them? Because she didn't know about the balcony access, and she drew the wrong conclusion from correct observations. She knew 3 people with motives had visited Gerald. She assumed one of them must be guilty. She never considered that the real killer was someone who didn't need to be seen entering or leaving. Someone who could come and go like a shadow. Slack stood, his expression grim. I'll need to interview Edith Price and Michael Stroud again, separately, and I'll want to search their belongings more thoroughly. I would suggest, Miss Marple said carefully, that you might also wish to examine the sugar supply at Gossington Hall. If I'm correct, you'll find that someone made certain special preparations. A small bag of sugar lumps, laced with digitalis, kept separate from the general supply, and introduced into the service only when Miss Price was ready to take her tea. After Slack left, moving with considerably more purpose than when he'd arrived, Miss Marple returned to her chair. She felt no satisfaction in this revelation, only a deep sadness. 2 murders, both born from greed and cold calculation. Gerald Folliot had been no saint, but he hadn't deserved to die in a hotel room, betrayed by his own blood. And Lavinia Price, for all her faults, had been murdered by her own daughter. The ultimate betrayal. But the case wasn't quite finished. There remained one final test, one last confirmation that would prove beyond doubt what Miss Marple knew in her bones to be true. And for that test, she would need the guilty parties to reveal themselves through their own actions. She picked up her knitting, the blue cardigan now nearly complete. Like the pattern before her, the mystery had finally become clear. Soon, Inspector Slack would have his evidence, and St. Mary Mead would once again be forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil could flourish even in the most peaceful of settings, wearing the most respectable of faces. Tomorrow, she thought, would bring the final unraveling. But tonight, she would simply knit and wait, as patient as justice itself. Chapter 7. The trap is set. Inspector Slack returned to Miss Marple's cottage late the following afternoon, and this time his expression was a mixture of triumph and chagrin. Triumph at having made progress, chagrin at having needed an elderly village lady to point him in the right direction. "You were correct about the sugar," he said without preamble. "We found a small tin in Edith Price's room at Gossington Hall, hidden inside a hat box. It contained 3 sugar lumps that match those used at the garden party. We've sent them to be analysed, but I'd wager my pension they're laced with digitalis." "Only 3?" Miss Marple inquired. "That's what struck me as well. Why keep them after the murder? Why not dispose of them immediately?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, "because she didn't have the opportunity. The murder occurred, the police arrived, and suddenly disposing of evidence became rather more conspicuous than simply hiding it and waiting for a safer moment. Or perhaps she kept them for another purpose," Slack said darkly. "We also found correspondence between Edith Price and Michael Stroud, quite intimate in nature, dating back several months. And there's more. I contacted the solicitor handling old Mrs. Folliot's estate. With Gerald dead, Michael Stroud inherits everything, some £40,000, plus property in London." Miss Marple nodded. "A considerable sum, more than enough motive for murder. But here's the interesting part. The will had a provision. If Gerald died within 5 years of his grandmother without issue, and if there was any suspicion of foul play, the estate would be held in trust pending investigation. The solicitor says Michael Stroud visited him twice in the past month, asking very specific questions about this provision. What would constitute suspicion? How long an investigation might take, that sort of thing." "He was worried," Miss Marple observed. "He thought he'd committed the perfect murder in London. But then Lavinia Price began her blackmail scheme. And suddenly there were questions, suspicions, the very thing he'd tried to avoid. So he and Edith conspired to kill Lavinia before she could make her accusations public. Remove the blackmailer, remove the suspicion, and claim the inheritance." Slack shook his head. "Cold-blooded, the pair of them. Have you arrested them?" "Not yet. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. A good barrister could argue the sugar lumps were planted by someone else. That the correspondence proves nothing more than an innocent romance. What we need is a confession, or at least evidence that directly ties them to the act of murder." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Then perhaps we might arrange for them to provide such evidence." "What do you mean?" "I mean, Inspector, that guilty people often reveal themselves when they believe they're safe, or when they believe themselves to be threatened. What if we were to suggest that there was a witness to the murder? Someone who saw something at the garden party, but hasn't yet come forward." Slack looked skeptical. "But there was no witness. If there had been, they'd have spoken by now. The murderers don't know that for certain. Think about it, Inspector. The garden party had perhaps 60 guests all milling about, all focused on their own conversations and concerns. Edith Price prepared the poisoned sugar and served it to her mother. But could she be absolutely certain no one was watching? That no one noticed the particular care she took with that specific cup? Understanding dawned in Slack's face. You want to make them think someone saw them. More specifically, I want to make them think I saw them, or rather, that I noticed something, some small detail that in light of subsequent events has taken on new significance. And you think they'll try to silence you? I think they'll panic, Miss Marple corrected. And panicked people make mistakes, particularly people who have already committed 2 murders and gotten away with them. They become overconfident in their ability to solve problems through violence. Slack frowned. It's dangerous, Miss Marple, if they believe you're a threat. Then they'll attempt to remove that threat, and you'll have your evidence. But you'll need to ensure that I'm properly protected, Inspector. I have no desire to become the 3rd victim in this sorry business. They spent the next hour working out the details. Miss Marple would let it be known through the village's efficient gossip network that she had remembered something important from the garden party. Something she'd seen but not fully understood at the time. She would arrange to meet Inspector Slack at Gossington Hall the following evening to make a formal statement, and she would make certain that both Edith Price and Michael Stroud learned of this plan. The key, Miss Marple explained, is to make it seem as though I'm uncertain about what I saw, that I'm still working it out in my mind. That will make them think they have time to act, to prevent me from solidifying my memories into actual evidence. That evening, Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Bantry and mentioned quite casually that she had been thinking about the garden party. There was something odd that I noticed, she said, her tone vague and musing, something about the tea service, or perhaps the way Edith was arranging the cups. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it's been nagging at me. I've told Inspector Slack I'll come to Gossington Hall tomorrow evening to discuss it properly. Perhaps seeing the setting again will help clarify my thoughts. Mrs. Bantry, bless her, played along perfectly without knowing she was playing at all. How intriguing, Jane. Do you think it's important? Oh, I couldn't say. Probably nothing at all. But one never knows, does one? The smallest details can sometimes prove significant. Within hours, as Miss Marple had known it would, the information had spread through St. Mary Mead. Miss Hartnell heard it from Mrs. Bantry's cook, the butcher heard it from Miss Hartnell, and Edith Price, still residing at Gossington Hall while recovering from her nervous collapse, certainly heard it from Mrs. Bantry herself, who mentioned it over dinner with all the innocence of someone who had no idea she was delivering a death sentence. Miss Marple spent that evening in her cottage, every lamp blazing, making herself visible through her windows as she moved about her normal routine. Inspector Slack had positioned 2 constables in plain clothes nearby, one in the garden, one on the street. But they were under strict orders not to interfere unless Miss Marple was in actual danger. Nothing happened that night, but Miss Marple hadn't expected it to. The murderers would need time to plan, to coordinate, to work out how to remove this new threat without drawing further suspicion to themselves. The following day passed with agonizing slowness. Miss Marple attended to her usual activities, a visit to the church, some shopping at the village stores, a brief call on an elderly parishioner who was ill. All the while she was aware of being watched, not by Inspector Slack's constables, but by others. She caught glimpses of Michael Stroud on 2 separate occasions, always at a distance, always observing. By evening, when she prepared to walk to Gossington Hall for her supposed meeting with Inspector Slack, her nerves were taut despite her outward calm. She wore her good coat, carried her handbag and umbrella. and set out along the familiar path just as the sun was setting. The attack, when it came, was not what she had expected. She had anticipated something subtle, perhaps poisoned tea at Gossington Hall, or an accident on the stairs. Instead, as she passed through the narrow lane bordered by high hedges that led to the hall's grounds, a figure stepped out from the shadows, Michael Stroud, and in his hand, clearly visible in the fading light, was a revolver. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple," he said, and he sounded almost sincere. "But you really should have minded your own business." Behind her she heard footsteps. Edith Price, blocking her retreat, her face pale but determined. Miss Marple stood very still, her mind working rapidly. Inspector Slack's constables were positioned at the cottage and at Gossington Hall. No one had anticipated an attack on the lane itself. She had, it seemed, outsmarted herself, and the penalty for that mistake was about to prove fatal. Chapter 8. A Conversation in the Dark. "I really am sorry," Michael Stroud repeated, and there was a tremor in his voice that suggested he might actually mean it. "But you must understand, we can't let you ruin everything, not when we're so close." Miss Marple stood perfectly still, her handbag clutched in both hands. Her mind was racing, but her voice, when she spoke, was as calm as if they were discussing the weather over tea. "So close to what, Mr. Stroud? The inheritance? I'm afraid that even if you silence me, Inspector Slack already knows everything. Killing me won't save you." "Slack knows nothing," Edith Price said from behind her, her voice sharp with fear and anger. "He has theories, suspicions, but no real proof. The sugar lumps could have been planted. The letters between Michael and myself prove nothing criminal. But you saw something. You're the only real witness." "And what exactly do you think I saw?" Miss Marple asked, genuinely curious despite her predicament. Michael's hand was shaking slightly, she noticed. The revolver wavered in his grip. He was no hardened criminal then, despite having committed 2 murders. He was simply a weak man who had taken a terrible path and found himself unable to turn back. "You were sitting under the beech tree," he said. "You had a clear view of the tea service. You must have seen Edith preparing Mother's tea, seen her use the special sugar." Miss Marple said softly. "But you see, I didn't. I was watching something else entirely at that moment. A robin that had landed near my chair. I'm quite fond of birds, you know. I find them endlessly fascinating." There was a pause. Edith moved closer, her breath coming quick and shallow. "You're lying. You said you remembered something." "I said I remembered something odd about the tea service. And I do, but not what you think." Miss Marple's voice remained steady, almost conversational. "What I remembered was that you weren't surprised, Miss Price. When your mother was found dead, everyone else was shocked, horrified. But you were frightened, certainly, but not surprised. The shock came later, after you'd had time to think about how you should behave." "That proves nothing," Edith snapped. "Grief affects people differently. Indeed it does, but there were other things, small things. The way you searched your mother's papers so frantically, looking for her notebook. The telephone calls to London, to Mr. Stroud. The 3 remaining sugar lumps you kept, hidden in your hat box. Why keep them, Miss Price? Insurance, perhaps. Evidence to use against Mr. Stroud if he tried to betray you." Michael's face paled. "Edith, you didn't—" "Of course I did," Edith said coldly. "Did you think I'd trust you completely? You killed your own cousin for money. What's to stop you from disposing of me once you have what you want?" The tension between them crackled like electricity, and Miss Marple saw her opening. Keep them talking. Keep them divided. Give Inspector Slack's men time to realize something was wrong. You planned it all very carefully, she observed. The murder of Gerald Folliot was particularly clever. A locked room that wasn't truly locked. Everyone focused on the 3 innocent visitors while you, Mr. Stroud, came and went like a ghost via the balcony. He told me about it, Edith said, and there was a strange note of pride in her voice. How he waited until Gerald was asleep, climbed across from the adjacent room, administered the morphine. Gerald never even woke. It was almost merciful. Edith, be quiet, Michael hissed. But Edith was beyond caution now, her words tumbling out in a rush. Mother ruined everything with her meddling. She found out somehow. I think she bribed someone at the hotel, a chambermaid perhaps. She didn't know the truth, but she knew enough to be dangerous. And she was going to use it, going to bleed us dry. She was my own mother, and she would have destroyed me for money. So you decided to destroy her first, Miss Marple said quietly. The poisoned sugar lumps. You prepared them beforehand, brought them to the garden party in your handbag. When it came time to serve tea, you made certain your mother received the fatal dose. She deserved it, Edith said, her voice breaking. After everything she'd done, all the years of controlling me, criticizing me, holding the purse strings so tight I could barely breathe, and then to blackmail us, her own daughter. She deserved what she got. And Diana Archer? Lydia Folliot? Did they deserve to be framed for crimes they didn't commit? Collateral damage, Michael said flatly, though his gun hand still trembled. We needed suspects. The more confusion, the better. Except, Miss Marple said, you weren't quite as clever as you thought. You made mistakes. The foxglove questions you asked Higgins. Far too early, before you knew you'd need to implicate Mrs. Folliot. The evidence you planted in her home was too convenient, too obvious, and the sugar lumps. She looked at Edith. Keeping them was foolish, necessary for your insurance against Mr. Stroud, perhaps, but foolish nonetheless. None of which matters now, Michael said, steadying his grip on the revolver, because you won't be alive to testify to any of it. But I already have testified, Miss Marple said calmly. Everything I know, I've told Inspector Slack. It's all written down in a statement I signed this morning. Killing me changes nothing except to add a 3rd murder to your tally. It was a bluff, and not a very good one, but it bought her precious seconds. Michael and Edith exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their faces. And in that moment of hesitation, a voice rang out from the darkness. That's quite enough, I think. Inspector Slack stepped out from behind the hedge, flanked by 2 constables. His revolver was drawn and pointed steadily at Michael Stroud. Drop the weapon, Mr. Stroud, now! Michael's face crumbled. For a moment, Miss Marple thought he might actually pull the trigger. Not at her, but at himself. But then his shoulders sagged, and the revolver fell from his nerveless fingers to the ground. Edith Price made a sound halfway between a sob and a scream. This isn't fair. She was supposed to be at Gossington Hall, not here in the lane. How did you... Miss Marple suggested we might want to cover all possible approaches, Slack said dryly. She thought you might attempt an interception before she reached the hall. Turns out she was right. As the constables moved forward to make the arrests, Miss Marple found her legs suddenly unsteady. Inspector Slack was at her side immediately, his hand under her elbow. Are you all right, Miss Marple? Quite all right, Inspector, she said, though her voice was not quite as steady as it had been. Though I must confess, when Mr. Stroud appeared with that revolver, I did wonder for a moment if my calculations had been incorrect. Your calculations were perfect, Slack said. We heard every word. They've confessed to both murders. Miss Marple watched as Michael and Edith were led away. their faces blank with shock and defeat. Two people who had chosen murder over morality, greed over conscience, and now they would pay the price for those choices. "Come," Inspector Slack said gently. "Mrs. Bantry is waiting at the hall. She'll want to know you're safe." As they walked together through the gathering darkness, Miss Marple reflected that justice, while sometimes delayed, did eventually arrive, though it brought little comfort to the dead and precious little satisfaction to the living. But it was, she supposed, better than the alternative. Chapter 9. Pieces of the Puzzle. The drawing room at Gossington Hall had become an impromptu gathering place for those most directly affected by the case. Mrs. Bantry had insisted on it, declaring that everyone deserved to know the truth now that the danger had passed. Dr. Haydock was there with his daughter Diana, who looked both relieved and exhausted. Lydia Folliot sat near the window, her composure finally cracking to reveal the strain of the past weeks. Colonel Bantry stood by the fireplace looking grim. Inspector Slack had allowed this informal gathering at Miss Marple's request, though he remained standing near the door with the air of someone who wanted to ensure no one slipped away with unanswered questions. "I still don't understand how you knew," Diana Archer said, her voice small. "How you knew it wasn't one of us, Mrs. Folliot or myself or whoever else Mother was trying to blackmail." Miss Marple, seated in her usual chair with a restorative cup of tea that Mrs. Bantry had insisted upon, set down her cup carefully before responding. "It was a matter of timing, my dear, and of understanding what kind of people we were dealing with. Your visit to London was entirely innocent. You went to retrieve your letters, nothing more." Mrs. Folliot's visit was equally innocent, though rather more unfortunate in its implications. Lydia Folliot's voice was hoarse. "Lavinia Price told me she knew I'd been to see Gerald. She said she had proof I'd killed him for the inheritance. I was terrified, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I knew how it would look. I'd argued with him that day about his gambling, about the shame he was bringing to the family name. We parted on terrible terms, and the next day he was dead. And that gave Miss Price exactly what she needed for her blackmail scheme," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "She knew you'd been there, knew about the argument, and assumed guilt where there was only coincidence. But you see, the real murderer made several crucial errors that pointed directly to him. Michael Stroud," Dr. Haydock said, shaking his head. "I've known that young man since he was a boy. Never would have thought him capable of such calculated evil." "The calculating was the problem, Doctor. He was too calculating, too careful. When he asked your gardener about Foxglove, Mrs. Bantry, he did so weeks before Lavinia Price's murder. Indeed, before there was any obvious reason to implicate Mrs. Folliot. Why would he be asking about Foxglove at that particular time?" Mrs. Bantry frowned. "I don't follow, Jane." "Because he and Edith Price were already planning Lavinia's murder, and they were already planning to frame Mrs. Folliot for it. But they didn't yet know that Mrs. Folliot had been to see Gerald in London. That information came later, from Lavinia's investigations. So Michael's questions about Foxglove were premature. He was laying groundwork before he knew exactly how the frame would be constructed." Inspector Slack nodded. "When I went back and checked the dates with old Higgins, it confirmed what Miss Marple suspected. Stroud was asking about Foxglove in early May. But Lavinia Price's notebook shows she didn't discover Mrs. Folliot's London visit until late May." "Then there was the matter of the locked room," Miss Marple continued. "When I heard about Gerald's death, my first thought was of a case I'd encountered years ago. A woman who poisoned her employer and made it look like a heart attack. But locked rooms are quite a different matter. They require careful thought. And when my nephew Raymond discovered the balcony access, suddenly the impossibility became quite possible. But why kill Gerald at all? Colonel Bantry demanded. Surely the inheritance wasn't worth murdering one's own cousin. £40,000 and London property is a considerable sum, Colonel. More than that, Michael Stroud was deeply in debt himself. Gambling debts, bad investments. He needed that money desperately. And Gerald was the only obstacle to it. Lydia Folliot's hands twisted in her lap. If only I'd gone to the police immediately when Lavinia approached me. If I'd told them about her blackmail threats instead of being paralyzed by fear. You would likely have become the third victim, Miss Marple said gently. Edith and Michael were quite ruthless once they'd committed their first murder. A second came easily to them. A third would have been simpler still. But how did you know about the sugar lumps? Diana asked. That's what I can't understand. How did you know that was how the poison was administered? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Process of elimination, my dear. The poison had to be delivered specifically to Miss Price. Yet the tea came from a communal pot. It couldn't be in the cup itself. Too uncertain. It couldn't be in the milk or the general sugar. Too many other people would have been affected. So it had to be in something personal to Miss Price. Something only she would consume. She always took exactly 2 lumps of sugar and a generous amount of milk. Everyone who knew her was aware of this habit. And Edith was serving the tea, Mrs. Bantry said slowly. She would have had the opportunity to ensure her mother received specific sugar lumps. Precisely. She prepared 2 lumps laced with powdered foxglove, probably ground very fine and mixed with regular sugar to disguise the taste and texture. She kept them separate, perhaps in her pocket or handbag, and when her mother requested tea, she made certain those particular lumps went into that particular cup. Dr. Haydock leaned forward. The amount of digitalis required to kill would have been substantial. She must have been harvesting and processing foxglove for weeks. I believe she was. And I believe Michael Stroud provided the expertise. He'd researched it thoroughly, asked his questions, learned exactly how to extract and concentrate the poison. They were partners in every sense, bound together by their crimes. There was a long silence. Finally, Lydia Folliot spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Gerald was far from perfect. He was wild, reckless, irresponsible, but he was family. And to think that Michael, his own cousin, someone who should have protected him. Greed makes monsters of us all, Miss Marple said quietly. Or rather, it reveals the monsters that were already there, hidden beneath respectable surfaces. Michael Stroud and Edith Price were not transformed by their circumstances. They simply showed their true natures when those circumstances made it convenient. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Folliot. I was prepared to see you hang for a crime you didn't commit. If Miss Marple hadn't intervened, you were following the evidence, Lydia said, or what appeared to be evidence. They were very clever about that. Not clever enough, Miss Marple corrected gently. Truly clever criminals don't exist in my experience. They make mistakes because they're human, and humanity always shows through eventually. Michael Stroud's mistake was asking his questions too early. Edith Price's mistake was keeping the remaining sugar lumps. Together, their mistake was underestimating an elderly woman who has spent 60 years observing human nature in a small village. Mrs. Bantry reached over and squeezed her friend's hand. Thank goodness for that, Jane. Though I must say, when I think of you standing in that lane with a revolver pointed at you. Best not to think of it, Miss Marple said briskly. It's over now. Justice will be served and St. Mary Mead can return to its usual peaceful existence. But even as she spoke, she knew that the village would never quite return to what it had been. The garden party at Gossington Hall would be remembered not for Mrs. Bantry's excellent sponge cake or the beautiful roses, but for the murder that had stained its memory. And the name Price would forever carry a shadow of betrayal and greed. Such was the price of evil in small communities. The poison spread far beyond its intended victims, touching everyone who had known the players in this tragic drama. Chapter 10. Reflections in a Garden. 3 weeks had passed since the arrests of Michael Stroud and Edith Price. The summer had reached its fullest bloom, and Miss Marple's garden was a riot of colour. Delphiniums and hollyhocks, roses and sweet peas, all flourishing under her careful attention. She sat in her favourite chair beneath the apple tree, her knitting finally completed. The blue cardigan lay folded beside her, ready to be wrapped and posted to her great-nephew. Mrs. Bantry had come to call, as she often did these days. The events at Gossington Hall had forged a deeper bond between the two women, one built on shared experience of darkness overcome. "I've had a letter from Raymond," Miss Marple said, pouring tea from her best china pot. "He says the trial has been set for October. Both have confessed, so it should be mercifully brief. Small comfort to those they destroyed," Mrs. Bantry said. "Poor Gerald Folliot. I know he was no saint, but to be murdered by his own cousin, and in such a calculated way, yes, though I suspect Gerald's own choices led him to that hotel room. If he hadn't been gambling, accumulating debts, placing himself in Michael's path—" Miss Marple paused. "Not that he deserved his fate, of course. No one deserves to be murdered. But our choices do shape our destinies, even when we don't intend them to." A robin landed nearby, cocking its head curiously at the two ladies. Miss Marple smiled at it, remembering how she'd used that very bird as an excuse in the lane 3 weeks ago. "Lydia Folliot has decided to move away," Mrs. Bantry reported. "She's going to live with her sister in Devon. She said she can't bear St. Mary Mead any more. Too many memories, too many whispers." "I'm sorry to hear it, though I understand. The village has not been kind in its gossip. You know how people are, Jane. They forget that she was a victim too, of blackmail, of false accusation, of terrible loss. Instead, they remember only the scandal," Miss Marple nodded. "It was the way of small communities. Long memories for sensation, short memories for compassion. In 50 years, people would still speak of that dreadful business at Gossington Hall. But they would forget Lydia Folliot's pain, Diana Archer's fear, all the collateral damage that murder left in its wake." "And Diana?" she asked. "How is she managing?" "Better, I think. Her father has been wonderful. Very understanding about the broken engagement, about everything. She's talking about going to London, training as a nurse, getting away from here, making a fresh start. A wise choice. Sometimes a fresh start is the only way to move forward." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the bees humming among the flowers and the distant sound of church bells marking the hour. "You know," Mrs. Bantry said suddenly, "I still don't quite understand how you knew. Really knew, I mean. Before you had evidence, before you'd worked it all out. When did you first suspect Michael Stroud and Edith Price?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "I'm not sure I can point to a single moment. It was more like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit where they were supposed to. Michael slipping something into his pocket at the garden party, so furtive, so guilty. Edith's lack of genuine surprise when her mother was found dead. The way she searched so desperately through Lavinia's papers. And underneath it all, the question that kept nagging at me, who benefits? Cui bono, Mrs. Bantry murmured. Precisely. Edith inherited her mother's estate. Not inconsiderable. Michael inherited his cousin's share of their grandmother's fortune. Both had clear financial motives. Both had opportunity. And both, I suspected, had the particular kind of moral weakness that allows one to justify terrible acts. Moral weakness, Mrs. Bantry repeated. You don't think they were evil, then? Just weak? I think weakness and evil are often two sides of the same coin, my dear. Michael Stroud wasn't born a murderer. He was born a weak man. Someone who wanted money and status without working for them, who resented his cousin's position as first heir. Given the right circumstances or the wrong ones, that weakness metastasized into something monstrous. And Edith? Much the same. A woman who'd lived under her mother's thumb all her life, controlled and criticized and made to feel worthless. Given the opportunity and the justification, her mother's blackmail, she convinced herself that murder was not just permissible, but righteous. Miss Marple shook her head. That's the danger of moral weakness. It allows us to rationalize anything if we want something badly enough. A thought seemed to strike Mrs. Bantry. Jane, when you were standing in that lane with Michael's revolver pointing at you, were you frightened? Miss Marple smiled slightly. Terrified, my dear. Absolutely terrified. But I've learned over the years that fear and action aren't mutually exclusive. One can be afraid and still do what needs to be done. You were very brave. No, I was very determined that justice should be served. It's not quite the same thing. She poured more tea, her hand perfectly steady despite the memory. The truth is, Dolly, I've spent my entire life in places like St. Mary Mead, watching people, understanding them. I've seen every variation of human nature, the good, the bad, the desperately misguided, and I've learned that most people, even murderers, are remarkably predictable once you understand what drives them. Greed, in this case. Greed combined with weakness, yes. The oldest story in the world, really. Cain and Abel, played out in an English village with foxglove instead of stones. They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence, two old friends sharing the peace of a summer afternoon. In the distance, Miss Marple could see Miss Hartnell walking past, no doubt full of the latest gossip. Life in St. Mary Mead continued, as it always did, the rhythm of village existence unchanged by murder and revelation alike. Do you ever wish, Mrs. Bantry asked quietly, that you could just enjoy your garden and your knitting, without getting involved in these dreadful matters? Miss Marple looked at her friend with genuine surprise. But I do enjoy my garden and my knitting, Dolly, very much. Getting involved in these dreadful matters, as you call them, doesn't diminish that enjoyment. If anything, it enhances it. How can that be? Because every time I help ensure that justice is served, that evil is confronted and punished, I make the world, my little corner of it, at least safer for the gardens and the knitting and all the small, peaceful pleasures that make life worth living. One cannot exist without the other. Mrs. Bantry smiled. You're a remarkable woman, Jane Marple. Not remarkable at all. Simply observant and perhaps a bit stubborn. The world has plenty of evil in it, Dolly, but it also has plenty of good. And as long as there are people willing to stand up for the good, even elderly ladies with knitting needles, evil will never entirely prevail. As the afternoon wore on, and Mrs. Bantry eventually departed, Miss Marple remained in her garden, watching the shadows lengthen across the lawn. The blue cardigan sat beside her, completed at last, every stitch in its proper place. Much like the mystery, she reflected, every piece where it belonged, the pattern finally clear. In the village, life continued its eternal round. Births and deaths, marriages and scandals, the small dramas that made up human existence. And Miss Marple, content in her garden, would watch and observe and occasionally intervene, as she always had. For that was her gift and her burden, her pleasure and her duty, to see clearly what others missed, to understand what others overlooked, to ensure that justice, however delayed, eventually found its way home. And in the meantime, there was always knitting to be done.